In this video, we'll talk about narrative analysis. And a narrative or a story is an account of a series of related events or experiences. And we are, in a way, all very familiar with different kinds of narratives. We meet them in movies, in fairy tales, in fiction literature, etc., etc. But narratives can be more than just fictional stories. Narratives are also used to tell stories of events and experiences that are true and that belong in the so-called real world. And both individuals and groups tell stories, and by analyzing these stories or narratives, we can understand how people make sense of the world around them. And in this video, we'll look at some characteristics of narratives, and we'll look at a couple of examples of narratives to hopefully make it a bit more clear what is meant by a narrative and how we can analyze these narratives. Narratives are characterized by the fact that they present a series of connected events. And it's by connecting different events together in a particular way that a narrative kind of gets its form and purpose, because the narrative will then communicate some ideas about cause and effect, about what happened first, what happened next, how what happened first led to what happened later. So by connecting events together, narratives communicate ideas about cause, effect, about how things are connected to each other. And that's interesting to analyze. How do individuals or groups connect different events together? Secondly, narratives are often organized around a plot. And a plot is the sequence or order in which the narrative tells the event. Because the events can be told is around a conflict between the main character in the narrative and other characters who might create hindrances or obstacles for the main character. And this brings us to the third point, that narratives includes characters or people who act. And characters can include the protagonist or the main character in the story. It can also include an antagonist, an individual or group who in some way oppose the protagonist and create hindrances for the protagonist. So there's a conflict between the main character and other characters involved in the story. It doesn't have to be a conflict in a narrative, but quite often narratives include conflicts. Narratives also have a beginning and an end. And when analyzing narratives, we can ask, where does the narrative start and end? Because you can tell a story in different ways. You can choose different starting points and choose different end points. For instance, if you want to tell the story of the current conflict in Syria, where do you start your narrative? Do you start with the popular protests against the Assad regime in 2011 during the Arab Spring? Or do you start your narrative earlier, for instance, with the end of the First World War when Syria came under French rule? Depending on where you start your narrative, you can change the whole narrative and what you communicate through the narrative. And narratives communicate a message. Narratives are told to somehow, there's a purpose, a message, something that the narrator, the one telling the story, wants to say through the narrative. And that's something we can analyze using narrative analysis. So let's look at an example of a narrative. And I've chosen the story of Malala Yousafzai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work for girls' rights to education. And she has founded her own foundation, the Malala Fund. And on the website of this fund or foundation that she runs, she presents her own story. And we can look at this story as a kind of narrative. And she starts her story with her birth in Pakistan in July 1997. And then choosing to highlight, I mean, there's a lot of things she could say about her birth, but choosing to highlight the fact that she's a girl and that welcoming a baby girl is not always a cause for celebration in Pakistan. But her father was determined to give her every opportunity that a boy would have. And then in her story, she skips over more than 10 years of time and everything that happened and continues the story in 2008 when her father was a teacher and ran a girls' school in her village. And then she says, everything changed when the Taliban took control of our town in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. That they banned a lot of things, including saying that girls could no longer go to school. So in January 2008, when Malala was 11 years old, she had to leave school because she was not allowed to go to school more. And here we can see that Malala, as the main protagonist or main character of this story, that there's some kind of resistance or conflict here between Malala and the Taliban as the antagonist of the story. And then the story continues. In 2012, Malala was speaking out publicly on behalf of girls, and that made her a target. And she was shot by a gunman on her school bus, and then later she was transported to Birmingham and woke up in a hospital in England 10 days later. And then, of course, everything that has happened between 2008 and 2012 is left out in this telling of the story. And then she moves on to 2014, when she won the Nobel Peace Prize. And the photo here is from her speech at the Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo in December 2014. And she writes, and after the attack and after the surgery, she had a choice to live a quiet life or to take up the fight and try to dedicate her life to fighting for the cause that every girl should have the right to go to school. And then she continues her story. In 2018, now she's a student at the University of Oxford studying philosophy, politics, and economics, and also leading a work as an activist to fight for the right of girls to receive education freely and safely through her work in the Malala Fund. So in this story that she presents on the website of the Malala Fund, she connects different events together, selecting which events to include into the stories. There's a lot of things that happen in her life that's not included. There's some characters here. Malala, of course, as the main protagonist. There's also her father. There's the Taliban. There's other characters involved. The story has a beginning and an end, and she chooses to start her story with her birth and the fact that she was a girl. Of course, she could have started the story with her attack, her being attacked by this gunman. But she starts the story with her birth, which makes the story a different kind of story. And then the story also has a clear message. Partly the message here with the blue background, that we who read this story on the website should join her fight for a better future for girls who are out of school. And this message is also summed up in this quote: "One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world," which is a quote from a speech that she held at the Youth Assembly at the United Nations in New York in 2013. So this is one example of a story that we can analyze using narrative analysis. Another example of a story, a much shorter story, is this quote from an interview from a book by Michelle Lemon, who's an American sociologist, where she has interviewed a financial officer working in New York, kind of tells the story of his career and how he arrived at the place he is currently, being a successful financial officer in New York. And this man tells the following story. I've always worked hard. I worked my way through college, through undergraduate school, and even through high school. My family didn't really have much in the way of assets, so I was kind of motivated to work hard. Everything was always hard work, and once I went to work for my present company 23 years ago, I was poised for an opportunity to succeed. If I failed, it was my own fault. So, in other words, because he succeeded, it was also his own, it was thanks to his own effort and hard work that this man succeeded. And this story is in a way an illustration of a larger story that we can call the American dream, the idea or story or narrative that if you only work hard, you will succeed. So what is left out of this story is the fact that maybe this man was lucky, maybe he had an beneficial background, that there's a lot of social structures in this story that probably helped him succeed in the way that he succeeded, but are left out of the story. And the focus is on his own hard work and how resilience and hard work made him the successful businessman he is currently. And analyzing the kind of stories people tell can tell us a lot about how they make sense of their own life, their own situation, what is important for them in life, etc. So it's possible to analyze the stories of individuals, as in this case of this businessman. It's possible to analyze stories in, for instance, speeches that politicians held. A lot of state leaders and politicians, when they hold speeches, the speech is often in the form of a narrative. Social movements, when they mobilize people to act for a certain cause, they often use stories to mobilize for actions, to make people join the cause, to convince them about the importance of being involved in the kind of activism that the social movement is involved in. And so narrative analysis can be used in many different ways to analyze different kind of stories in different contexts.